The Arctic is the northernmost region of the Earth, covered approximately 60% by the waters of the Arctic Ocean and extending around the North Pole. 8 countries possess Arctic territories: Canada, Denmark, Finland, Iceland, Norway, Sweden, the United States, and Russia. In recent years, the High North has emerged as one of the main hotspots for future geopolitical competition. This is mostly due to ice melting caused by global warming, which will likely uncover huge mineral deposits, hydrocarbons, and rare earths, and will also facilitate navigability in the Arctic, a side effect of climate change that has already made it possible to chart naval routes once unthinkable. The Russian Federation makes up nearly half of the terrestrial Arctic and plays the most active role among the 8 Arctic states. Under the leadership of Vladimir Putin, many Russian policies have focused on the lands above the Arctic Circle. This became evident as early as 2007, when 2 mini-submarines planted a titanium Russian flag on the seabed of the Arctic Ocean, claiming Moscow's sovereignty over the ice region. After that, the Kremlin has kept investing in its 24,000 kilometers of Arctic coastline, growing its icebreaker fleets and seeking opportunities in the energy, economic, and security domains. Several partnerships have been sealed with China, especially in relation to mega projects such as the Power Siberia 2, the pipeline designed to deliver gas from the Arctic Yamal Peninsula to China across Mongolia. This project is currently hindered by logistical difficulties and construction delays, but is crucial for Moscow, as it seeks to replace the larger customer for its gas, Europe. Another example is the flow of investments aimed to increase both cargo traffic and trade volumes via the so-called Northern Sea Route, the maritime transport route which, from the Russian Far East, would allow merchant ships to sail to northwestern Europe with reduced travel time. This alternative route would also make for a safer option, given the current high instability in the Red Sea and through the Suez Canal. Aside from climate change, international politics have certainly contributed to increasing the strategic relevance of the Arctic for Russia. Fresh confrontation between Russia and the West in the wake of the war in Ukraine has indeed reached all the way to the far north. This is why the other 7 Arctic states decided to suspend the work of the Arctic Council, the main platform for regional cooperation, following the invasion of Ukraine. Deteriorating ties with the West also underlie Russia's latest foreign policy concept, which exposes Moscow's hardline against the, quote, unfriendly states policy aimed at limiting Russia's ability to exercise its sovereign rights in the Arctic zone, end quote. Certainly, as the war effort drags on, the Kremlin's financial capabilities to invest in the region diminish. But even if the war in Ukraine came to a halt, cooperation between Russia and the West in the Arctic wouldn't probably resume fully. To discuss all these and try to imagine Russia's future in the Arctic, we asked a few questions to Pavel Baev, ISPI Senior Associate Fellow from the Oslo International Peace Research Institute and one of the leading experts on the Russian policies in the Arctic. Enjoy. Hi, Pavel. Welcome. Dobar požalovat. To get started, what are Russia's interests and priorities in the Arctic? Also, how did the conflict in Ukraine impact on Russia's Arctic policies?
Yes, it is an important question, even if it's a broad one. And what I want to emphasize here is that certainly Russia has a lot of interests in the Arctic. It is a great Arctic power by every measure. And the Arctic is hugely important for kind of Russian prospects of development. So Russia's prime interest in the Arctic are essentially about development. They need to find a way to, so to say, keep its people in the Arctic. Russia has much more urban centers, many more people in the Arctic than any other state which is included in the Arctic family, so to say. Russia needs to make sure that the people who live in the Arctic can enjoy life, so to say. that the Arctic remains livable. And it means investment in trade, it means jobs, and it means resource development. This is a core interest. And certainly Russian Arctic policy, which has been very prominent for the last 20 years at least, is very much about that. But there was always another element to Russian Arctic policy, which was about security, which was about militarization. And these two directions in the Russian Arctic policy, economic development and militarization, were never in perfect sync, so to say, never in harmony. There was always a conflict between them. And this conflict between goals of development and goals of militarization, I think, has become very acute since the start of the conflict with Ukraine already in the year 14. And since 22, the gap has become really an abyss.
It seems that the Arctic might turn to be a land of opportunities for the Russian Federation. Yes, it's appeared that Moscow is also far from being capable of taking full advantage of its Arctic territories. Is it really so? What Russia can be optimistic about, and what are the shortcomings instead?
It is, an interesting picture about the Arctic as a land of opportunities. It's not only land of opportunities, it's also ocean of opportunities, so to say. And in the Russian perceptions of the Arctic, it was a very clear shift in the last 15 probably years towards offshore, about the resource developments in the Arctic seas, which is a controversial topic also in Norway, because Arctic environment is very fragile, and the Arctic seas is really an important part of this environment. And nobody essentially knows whether Arctic seas contain a lot of oil and gas. The estimates are very approximate, and the kind of real knowledge about these resources is still very, very sketchy. But as far as land, it's clear that Russia has a lot of potential for development in its Arctic regions, from the western part in the Kola Peninsula to the far east in Chukotka, and certainly in Yakutia. The capacity for making economy thriving is there. The only thing which is really missing is the capacity to invest in various projects, from the Northern Sea route to resource development, to development of human capital, to building up universities and scientific potential. Everything needs investment, and the capacity to invest is severely undercut by the beginning of the war with Ukraine, full-scale war in the year 22, nearly exactly 2 years ago, because so much of Russian resources, financial resources, human resources, is going towards sustaining the war. It essentially is wasted in the war. So the Arctic development has become severely under-resourced. And I think the damage to Russian interests in the Arctic is yet to be estimated. The war is still going on, but we see that it is accumulating in several dimensions, including the human capital which is available there, and including the energy projects of crucial importance which are located in the high north. The risks of various disasters in the Russian Arctic is growing, and the capacity to address these risks is diminishing.
One of the most ambitious projects that Russia has in store for the Arctic is the Northern Sea route. What's the potential of this project, and what are the main obstacles undermining it?
The whole idea of Northern Sea route in the last, 30 years experienced several ups and downs. And the underpinning proposition is that the Arctic ice is melting. And so the Northern Sea route is becoming more accessible. It's not a hypothetical proposition, Nordic Sea route. It was an exploitation since, I don't know, late 50s. It's, you know, Soviet Union used the Arctic Northern Sea route for Sevmorput for many purposes. But the real kind of economic potential of this trade route in the kind of globalizing economy is still very uncertain. And for instance, the whole idea that kind of Arctic ice is melting is also not very straightforward. The lowest amount of ice happened to be in the year 2013, very low. And that moment, there were a lot of expectations that suddenly the trend is up and up. It never happened again. Since the year 13, yes, it's kind of still the ice is kind of below the multi-year average, but nothing close to happened in the year 13. So kind of presently, for that matter, you look at the Northern Sea route, and you see it's an opportunity because the Suez Canal is threatened by the crisis in the Red Sea. Maybe there is kind of a possibility to reroute the maritime traffic there, but it is now closed. It's winter. It's not really accessible during winter months, so all the ships are rerouted around Africa. And you know, so the proposition for the Northern Sea route as a transit corridor is still very uncertain. It is gradually increasing in its use because much of the oil and liquefied natural gas produced in the Russian Arctic are exported through that sea corridors. But as far as kind of transit capacity is concerned, again, it's something you need to invest in. You need to build ports and secure navigation. You need to invest in all sort of naval infrastructure. And what Russia was investing in the High North in the last, I don't know, 10 years was primarily building a new chain of small but significant military bases. Military bases may serve against some hypothetical threat to navigation. I don't see any real threat, but they're not really very useful for ensuring safety of navigation in the Northern Sea route. And now these military bases are becoming very hard to sustain because there are heavy maintenance. You need to kind of supply them, and supplies are difficult and expensive. So in the present Russian military situation, these assets are not particularly valuable, but many other investments necessary for the Northern Sea route to function and just not done, and I don't see any prospect how they might be done.
Russia makes up nearly half of the terrestrial Arctic, but global collaboration with researchers there has stopped since the invasion of Ukraine. The lack of data coming from Russian scientific stations may severely deteriorate our understanding of the changing Arctic, with bleak consequences for the study of and fight against climate change. Can this course be reversed?
Well, it's kind of hypothetical scenarios, but obviously in some areas, the interruption of scientific cooperation is very unfortunate. And it's less probably about the ice in the Arctic. Ice you can observe very well from the satellites. This data is quite reliable, so there is no any reduction of information about the kind of the conditions for navigation, for that matter. What is important is the permafrost, the thawing of the permafrost, and that is a matter of huge concern for Russia. While kind of less ice in the Arctic may be beneficial for the Northern Sea route, but the permafrost is a huge problem because a lot of the infrastructure in the Russian High North is essentially built on permafrost. The pipelines and the development or the project as far as oil and gas is concerned, a lot of that is on the very shaky foundation, so to say, because permafrost is thawing. And this data cannot be obtained from the satellites. You really need to be there. So in this regard, interruption of scientific cooperation is very unfortunate. And Russia is the main, in fact, the main victim of this interruption, because it needs this information more than anybody else. This kind of sustained cooperation for Russia is not just a good thing to have. It's a crucial need. So I think that when we will come out of this war, when sooner or later, and I hope sooner, the beginning of the kind of new ties between Russia and the West will start happening, Arctic will be the first area where it will be possible. There is a good institution called the Arctic Council, where Russia is still a member, even if its membership is effectively frozen. And I think that the experience they have in this institution will help in resuming the cooperation in this area as soon as possible, as soon as the window will open.
But is the Arctic bound to be yet another area of competition between Russia and the West, or is there a possibility to see a resumption of the cooperation? And if so, under what circumstances? For example, emergency response?
Yeah, it is certainly a question about what sort of disaster we are facing. And the kind of recent experiences in confronting such, for instance, global disasters as the pandemic isn't very encouraging in this respect. Suddenly we had the situation where every country was for itself. And Russian cooperation in facing the pandemic with the West wasn't really an example for other areas. As far as the Arctic Council is concerned, I think Russia had great hopes for this institution. In fact, it assumed the rotating chairmanship in that institution in the year 21 and had great plans for the 2 years where it was supposed to be to have that position. There was big programs, there was a lot of initiatives. It was really a good start to this whole kind of window of opportunity. And everything was interrupted in February 22. Russian chairmanship was put on ice, and now Norway has the rotating chairmanship and tries to find a way to keep the institution going without Russia. But in many areas, you find the situation that kind of international cooperation in the Arctic without Russia makes rather limited sense. It's much the same as talking about, I don't know, addressing climate matters without China. When the pressing need will overcome the obstacles that there is a tradition in the Arctic Council somehow to break it out the security matters, to focus on matters of, I don't know, environment, economic development, rights of the kind of native people of the Arctic. So it continued after the beginning of the Russian conflict with Ukraine in the year 14 and 15. And it was only the kind of the full-scale war that really interrupted the working of the institution. But I think many stakeholders in the Arctic cooperation are really very eager to look for every opportunity to resume the ties, which are of great significance for many Arctic states and for many other global actors who are interested in the Arctic development. But what it will take, I think that until the war in Ukraine continues as it goes, we cannot hope for any resumption of meaningful ties, even if something would, and yes, various disasters are thinkable, including, for instance, a disaster like the Kursk submarine in the year 2000, where international cooperation was very helpful in establishing the causes in lifting the submarine from the seabed and bringing it back to Russia. Everything was done with international cooperation. Imagining such a, it is certainly an exercise of thinking about unthinkable. But it is possible Russian submarines continue to go in the Arctic waters. Is anything of this sort happens, what would be the first reaction in Moscow? That it is a hostile act from NATO. It was one of the hypotheses with the Kursk as well, but very soon it was kind of disproved, and international cooperation was very helpful, as I have mentioned. If it happens now, I don't think it will be possible to disprove this hypothesis. So the first response from Moscow to the presumed hostile act from NATO might be very strong and entirely negative for the Arctic cooperation.
So far, we talked about the Arctic mostly referring to Russia's enemies. On the other hand, what could be the role of its perceived closest partner, for example, China, in the region?
China is both showing interest in the Arctic and at the same time is very careful about executing or implementing these interests. One thing which was very clear in this Chinese interest in the Arctic is that China is not interested at all in militarization. China wants very much the Arctic to be an area of cooperation, kind of trade, investment, also this of opportunities. So Russian policy of militarization of the Arctic was never welcomed in China and still isn't. A new turn in this plot is that now that the Western investors are effectively out, Russia is left only with China for finding opportunities for sustaining the Arctic development. And China is also quite cautious and reluctant. It's showing interest, but it's not really ready to invest seriously in the Russian Arctic, as it isn't interested in investing in Russia in general. Trade is expanding, but investment is not. And China has all sorts of worries and concerns about kind of Russia's war in Ukraine and obstacles to various initiatives which Russia is trying to push forward kind of remain fairly tall. So I don't think China will be kind of pushing its interests while kind of Russia has no way to say no now to its great neighbor. I don't see any increase in China's activities in the Arctic as one might expect. Yes, China has one big project, joint project with Russia on the Yamal Peninsula with the kind of Yamal LNG, where it invested, but happened kind of 5 years ago, 6 years ago. But nothing of the sort is in the menu, so to say, presently. China shows interest in expanding its scientific cooperation in the Arctic, but China doesn't want that cooperation to be strictly bilateral. So China is trying to expand its connection with the Arctic Council, where Russia is presently frozen out. China is trying to engage with other stakeholders in the Arctic. So I think that Russia-China cooperation in the Arctic isn't showing great momentum. And I don't think the picture will change during this year, whatever twists and turns happened in the war. And I think China is also have a very clear picture about real economic impact of the war in Russia, about Russia's capacity to sustain development in the Arctic. And China doesn't want any responsibility for things that might be happening in the Arctic, where the technological risks are really growing, particularly with the departure of many Western service companies like Halliburton from the energy projects in the high north. And I think China is fairly aware that the risks are growing, and being kind of a part of the problem is not really China's policy.